what I was hoping to uncover was the magnitude of these numbers. When people start throwing trillions of dollars, when the news anchor, Brian Williams, tells you that the deficit is $1.3 trillion, does that mean anything to us? Well, number one, we've learned he might be lying. Those who follow the thing there, Brian, that was supposed to be a joke. If you guys would watch the news, you'd really be laughing really loud right now. So Brian Williams said that he was served in the military a little more forcefully than on this scary mission than what it turned out. So anyway, glad that one fell flat on its face here. So does the 1.3 trillion really hit us hard? Is it a lot? The news media tends to make it scary. Like, wow, $15 trillion worth of debt. We're going bankrupt. We're screwed. What should we do? The sky is falling, Chicken Little. You know, all of that. That's kind of the portrayal in the media with these big numbers. And at the end of the day, we don't really know what $1 trillion is, right? I mean, it has no impact on our little lives here where maybe if you make $100,000 a year, that kind of helps. So, Connor, did I see you had a question?
I was just curious if you remember that joke the
No,
other day.
I didn't remember it, but what I'm going to do is come up with a new one.
Okay.
And I told Sarah I have the joke, kind of the first draft of it, but it's still kind of lame. So I'm getting closer. So I will. And now, as I raise expectations, it's just gonna really fall flat again. But all right. So our next step with this trick here is to take out these zeros. On your paper, just put a line through them, just similar to what I did here. Take out these zeros. And go ahead and do that for the income and the deficit as well. And what I'm trying to do is bring this down back to reality, or something that is not even necessarily reality, but something we can try to get our arms around a lot better. And I want to tell you a different story. This story is a young couple that graduated from Ottawa. They fell in love their senior year. And they went and got themselves a couple new jobs, and they're 4 years into it, starting maybe a young family. And currently their combined income is $145,000 a year, right? Just kind of picture yourself in that position, you and your new spouse making combined $145,000 a year. Now that year they went out and bought a home, and like many starter couples, they took on a mortgage because they didn't have cash for it, and they bought a $110,000 house, but they still have a debt on it of $97,558. They've got some serious debt, right? $97,558. And this year, because they're expecting, they actually took on another $13,000 worth of debt. There was a car purchase, they had to paint the addition for the baby coming, they had some other unexpected things that came on. And so this young couple, when they already had $97,558 worth of debt, they took on an additional $13,000 worth of debt. Is this couple in big time trouble financially? Not too bad, right? Why? They're still making a pretty good... In other words, couples that you guys might know that are making $145,000, which you might not know too many of them, because that's up there, by the way. If they're making a combined $145,000 of debt, what is more likely their debt on their house? 2, 3 maybe even, possibly. Especially in the good old days. Hopefully there's less of that going on. But they have a lot bigger debt. So is this couple in trouble? Maybe this is, I could have woven a different story and said student loan debt and housing debt or something. But at the end of the day, when we start to get rid of all these trillions of dollars and start to wrap our brain around how big the debt and deficit actually are, the actual size of the debt, I say, is relatively insignificant for the United States as well as for our fictitious couple here. The size, to me, doesn't matter. in this context. Okay? But I think there's some pretty darn important things that do matter, just not the absolute size of the debt and perhaps even the deficit at this point in time. At a point in time, if I look at the magnitudes of these numbers, I'm not that troubled. But there's a lot of other things that trouble me about this situation. What are they? What are some things that we should be troubled by? Maybe you're troubled still by the size, and that's fine. But even if you're troubled by the size, there's probably more troubling things out there than just the size alone. What's troubling? What do you think? What are some things to be scared about with this situation, maybe? Looking beyond the numbers here, because I'm already saying that the absolute sizes here probably aren't earth-shattering. But what are some issues that might be important for this? We keep taking it on. Yeah, that's a troubling aspect of this, right? The foreigners was something else that was brought up. Maybe there's something there. I'm less worried about the foreigners aspect because I feel like I kind of hold the power position if it's the foreigners that have it. Remember the whole giving the bird thing? I think that was actually Janet Yellen giving the bird. But it's kind of like the United States and China too. If they're holding on to half of our debt, we just say, adios, we're done. We kind of hold maybe the power with that one too. And that's kind of what we did, by the way, by running monetary policy the way we've done. Remember from the international trade chapter, if we pursue inflationary policies, what happens to the value of the dollar? Does it go up or down? It goes down in value in terms of its purchasing power. And so who does that help, China or us? It turns out to help us. And so the Chinese, that's kind of our way of giving the bird to them without hopefully causing World War III, is that if the value of the dollar starts to change, could work to our benefit. Okay. So the pattern seems a little more troubling. What do you mean by that? Somebody other than Bo. What would be troubling about like how we got here? What is the real pattern that's been going on? We spend more than we get? How long has this been going on for? We've kind of talked about this in and out of other chapters. Yeah, 45 years, maybe even as long of. We've had this long stretch of deficit, plus deficit, plus deficit, plus deficit, plus deficit, plus deficit. And so the pattern has been very clear that the debt has continued to rise due to even ever-increasing deficits. There's been little points in history where we actually ran a small surplus, where tax collections were greater than government spending. First time in my life that I ever saw that happen. And guess what George Bush decided to do? He said, oh, we got this extra money. You know, we can always pay this later. Let's give it back to the people. And so we gave money back to the people because of the surplus. We collected too much tax from you. And so we didn't even end up putting that towards the debt. At the time, the economy was in a little bit of a slowdown, so they thought it was a good stimulus thing to do, was to rebate checks back to the general public. So that's the thing that's the most scary about it. So the absolute size of it doesn't bother me, but the patterns that have been evolving over time are much more troubling. All right, so what should we focus on? You know, what are the things that need to be looked at? The inside guts is what counts. The G and the T, if that's our deficit, what are we spending our money on? Is it worthwhile? What caused this to be bigger than this? Are we doing roads and bridges and internet superhighway and education? Or are we doing other programs? Are we giving it away overseas? Are we giving it away to our own people through entitlement programs? What are we doing with the money is the real issue at hand. I'm not so concerned about the size of the deficit on any given year, but I am concerned on what's being spent on the G side, as well as how are we collecting that money on the T side. Should we have more of a sales tax, more of an income tax? Should those change? Does our corporate income tax end up hurting us in terms of competition overseas? Does our corporate income tax drive companies to relocate overseas when they were perfectly happy being a little American company? But when they had to face 15% income tax, they're like, it's really kind of sunny over in Indonesia and the Philippines and places in India. There's beautiful southern part of India where all the tech companies are kind of collected. Maybe we'll just do business there with this globalized economy. I don't mind selling stuff to the Americans, but to manufacture something there is getting kind of spendy in terms of labor, but it's also kind of spendy in terms of the income tax. If my company's profitable, the American government is taking 15% off the top. If I make $1 million, the government's taking $150,000 of that before I've even paid my shareholders. Whereas if I just relocate to India, now I have to face the Indian government, by the way, with my India example, so you might face some different things, but somewhere else around the globe where there's not corporate income tax, maybe that would be the most profitable thing to do. So we've got all these interesting issues to think about as we look at government spending and taxation. Okay, questions or comments? All right, so we'll come back to this one. Yeah, we're going to come back to that one later. I want to tee up some other things first here. So let's take a look at what this budget looks like. What are the things we're spending on? What are the guts inside the plan? We've got a lot of these perceptions in the United States that maybe it's a good idea to just tax the rich and give it to the poor. And maybe there's something to be said there. We just got to kind of look at what might be a good spot. All right, so here is the 2011. Shoot, I just thought of something. I just got updated with the 2013. I probably could have brought that in, but that's all right. We'll do the 2011 budget here. So this is the federal budget, and this is 2011. So we're going to look at receipts and outlays. Receipts and outlays. So the total for the United States was $2.8 trillion. I'm trying to decide if I should, let's go ahead and I'll just write it. This is the way your textbook lines it up. So this is 2.8 trillion. This is really in billions of dollars. So 2,807 billion. 2,000 billion is 2.8 trillion, right? So you'll see it. I decided to not shortcut it since you'll see it in the book this way, perhaps, as we've seen with some of our homework. Well, where does that come from? We've got personal income taxes, right? Individuals paying their income tax make up $1 trillion of that, 1,076. The government collects Social Security tax. And that is close to the same amount, a little over $1 trillion, 1,054 billion. So you can see we got the lion's share already. Personal income tax, Social Security tax. And then we've got those evil corporations, corporate income tax. Now, would you expect that to be higher than personal income tax? The corporate income tax, those corporations, that big business pays a lot more than all the individuals. So if we think about the flow of things here, who pays more income tax, households or big business? How many people would think big business pays the freight? Because that's the way I thought. I don't see too many people raising your hand. I don't know if we're just not quite there, but is it almost the same then? So if you're thinking you're under, is it almost the same or is it a lot smaller? To me, it turned out to be shockingly small. Thought? And what were you thinking? Close? So, corporate income tax, I always thought that they were the big bad ones that paid the freight. $432 billion. So less than half of what the personal income tax rate is. And then finally we have this little category that I mentioned a little bit earlier, indirect business taxes. Indirect taxes makes up a small portion here, $245 billion. And so that's our breakdown on the income side. These numbers add up to our $2.8 trillion. That's the composition of our tax collections on the income tax side for the federal government. How many of you have heard of the double taxation to corporations? Does that ring a bell for a couple accounting? Maybe you had some accounting, double taxation. What's going on with that concept relative to this? Double taxation that kind of corporations face. Remember what the deal was? Who do I see? Joe and somebody else? Don't mean to put all the pressure on Joe. Probably worth an extra credit point if you can pull it off.
Their tax on revenue. People are taxed on the stock.
Okay, good. So I'll give you the extra credit point. I want to clean up a little bit. So they're not taxed on the income, yeah, the profit. So they're taxed on the level. So if the corporation made $1 million, and the corporation's going to face a corporate income tax. Let's just say it's 15, which this wouldn't be totally fair, but maybe the taxable income for the corporation was 15%. So that $1 million, they have to pay $150,000 worth of tax, leaving $850,000 of profit. And what do companies do with their profit? Who might get from it? Some of the owners, the shareholders, right? And so that was the second part of what Joe was saying. So they're going to take that $850,000, and if there's 85 shareholders, how much is each one going to get zapped with for profit? 100, 1,000, right? So we're going to divvy up those profits among the people, and guess what they're going to pay? Personal income tax. So each shareholder is going to get a distribution of the profit, and then they're going to get hit with a personal income tax. Double taxation of our current system. I'm not a big fan of our current system. I think we should eliminate corporate income tax. Not so much for maybe the distributional effects in terms of taxing the rich to give to the poor, or having the rich pay proportionately more of their income. I'm actually in favor of that, which might surprise some of you. But I think that the rich should pay a little bit more of a fraction of their income compared to the poor. We'll get back to that topic a lot later, but that's called the proportional effect to our income tax rate. So proportionately, the rich pay a little bit more than the poor. I'm okay with that, but I don't like the negative effects that this has with the United States competing on the global arena. Because there's lots of countries where those corporations can go take up their business and they won't pay the corporate income tax. And so for the United States to compete on a global level, if we eliminated that, that would help. Now the fair question would be, hey, if we eliminate that, that 432 goes away. What are you going to do there? Well, I might be okay with some sort of offsetting tax system. Part of that, if we still have an income tax around, could be that wealthier citizens, who are likely the ones that own the corporations anyway. You see what I'm doing? I'm just kind of shifting that money back to a single tax system where the people who own those shares just pay it up here rather than down here. All right? So there's all kinds of interesting things we can start to think about with tax policy and spending policy of the how. How we do it might be a way, there might be ways to do it such that the government still collects the same amount of tax, we're just doing it differently. Well,
Switching it to like indirect, making it more indirect taxes.
so the indirect, in general, no. I wouldn't be a fan of that because we lose our transparency. So by having these kind of hidden taxes down here, all it does ultimately is it raises the price of the good. So gasoline is a great example, where there's these other taxes that are going on at different levels of government that jacks up the price of gasoline. The consumer says, oh, I just pay at the pump, I pay what I pay. Well, that price at the pump has kind of a hidden tax in it. And so anything that reduces the transparency of the tax system, I'm usually not in favor of. And so I wouldn't move that direction. At least with personal income taxes, it's very transparent. We know what we're getting into. The tax bracket I fall into if I make $50,000 or $70,000 or $120,000, the tax bracket's going to be what it's going to be, and I do my taxes and I pay it. At least it's transparent in terms of the pricing system. Okay, other comments or questions there? All right, so that's a little bit on the T side. So from our equations, big T is the 2.8 trillion. So next I want to look at the G, which is outlays in general. So outlays, which you can think of as the G part. Government spending, government outlays of cash for 2011 was $4,129 billion, or 4.1 trillion. You guys can keep working right down your sheet if you want. Of that amount, transfer payments kind of takes the cake. Transfer payments ends up being $2.5 trillion. So $2,588 billion is transfer payments. What's that? What is a government transfer payment? Let me go to Chris. What do you think, Chris, on transfer payments here? What do you think? Can you give me any example of what transfer payments are? So we got the government that is collected money from over here through taxes
Right.
somehow. And then part of their spending of money is in this category called transfer payments.
Well, would like would welfare, Social Security,
Yes.
would that count? Like what you were just talking about with the
Yes.
other than the deficit with the Bush administration.
Right.
All that counted as one.
That's right. So those are examples of it. So welfare is a good one. Social Security. Unemployment claims, if somebody has unemployment insurance. Anytime we're giving money to somebody and they didn't earn it, right? They didn't earn a paycheck, they weren't working for the government, they were just given money, that's a transfer payment. Because what we're effectively doing is taking from one person and giving it to the other. It's really a forced payment. I'm getting taxed somewhere over here, like Social Security. They're taking from the young and transferring it to the old. Kind of what I call in this stuff the Robin Hood theory. So on the diagrams here, I've got G3 that I call the Robin Hood stuff. Take from the rich, give to the poor. Take from the young, give to the old. Take from the employed, give to the unemployed, right? All of those sorts of programs all fall into this category of transfer payments. And you can see that it makes up a large fraction of the grand total. A pretty
Hey,
big
Russ.
chunk. Yes, Chris?
Would the bailout situation count as one of those transfer payments, like with the Citigroup and all those guys, or would that be something else?
It probably, that's kind of complicated. It could have been a mixed bag of them because if they're spending money on subsidies, in some of those bailout situations, they purchase shares of the company. And so they were actually buying something. It probably would have fell onto the spending category, which we're going to do. So it was probably a mixed bag of it. Okay, good. Any other questions or comments? All right. So transfer payments is big. So then the next one is really the weapons of mass destruction category, expenditure on goods and services. So the toilet paper at the White House, that's right here as part of this $1,181 billion, $1.1 trillion. Some amount of that was toilet paper at the White House. Some amount of that was some of the bullets that we have in our inventory. Some of that was the missiles that we have ready to knock out some of the bad guys around the world, right? So that is the spending that we did on final goods and services. That's the one that comes to mind quite a bit when we think about government spending. From our market system again, remember the government is entering the private system, going to Walmart and buying some toilet paper, right? So part of that money is going up into the market system to buy it. Spending on final goods and services. Okay, and then our last category has been on the rise over the last few years, although it's still pretty low because of the Federal Reserve doing some stuff, and that is debt interest. But this one has, a lot of people are eyeballing this one. It's the amount of interest payments that we're making on that $9.7 trillion of debt that we have outside the government. In 2011, it was $360 billion, so quite substantially less than these other components of government. The interest on the debt. But again, you'll hear that as kind of a scare tactic, potentially. Oh, the interest on the debt is going to kill us in this country. We gotta. Well, maybe. And again, that's been continuing to grow, but it's not probably the lion's share of the issues of spending. There's a lot bigger money being spent up here. Spending on education, probably would fall into this expenditure on goods and services, by the way, if we're with the money that we're spending there in terms of the paychecks that we have to teachers at the high school and some of the infrastructure that we have at the public school system, that would fall into that category. All right, so once again, we've got these three things are kind of our primary areas that lead us to having a G of 4.1 trillion. And so for the fiscal year 2011, we had the deficit equal to G minus T of $1,322 billion. 1.3 trillion bucks was the deficit. Okay, so any questions there? So I'm going to put down the screen to show you a picture from the textbook on what these look like over time. So this graph is figure 13.3. And the time span here is 1980 all the way up to close to present day. It stopped there a little bit before 2010. But you can see the movement of these variables over time. Social Security, indirect taxes, corporate income taxes, and personal income tax. And so the blue here, as we move through time, is the breakdown of those numbers at each slice in time. And so here in 2000, we had this pretty high, then personal income tax collections went down. Social Security's remained kind of this fat band here. What causes this to narrow at different points? Like, look at this here. It was starting to narrow quite a bit here post early 2000s. Here it was pretty fat after 2000. What causes personal income tax to change like that? GDP, right? Because GDP is what? How does the system work again here? So you're right, Jeff, GDP. GDP is total income, right? Total income for the nation. Why would this still go down, though? There's one other piece to the puzzle. So if income goes down, what else might have changed? If we're thinking about the total tax collections. Not consumption, because we're just looking at income tax. The rate, right? So we have different rates. So each year, Congress is proposing, well, I think we need to change the capital gains rate, or we need to increase the corporate income tax rate. We need to change the highest marginal rates for the rich people from 36% to 39%, right? So there's a whole bunch of tax rates. We've mostly just generalized it down to for principles of econ class, to our simple little t times our income, but our big T is equal to little t times our gross income. There's real GDP. If the tax rate is 10%, 10% times my income gives me the total amount of T, right? So you got both of those things going on. The economic activity for the nation causes real GDP to fluctuate all on its own, as well as nominal GDP. Which is kind of an interesting thing. I think it's discussed a little bit more in this chapter. Are we taxed on our real GDP or on our nominal GDP? What are we taxed on? which is kind of a loaded question, but so when I actually calculate this, is this nominal GDP or real GDP for 2000? Let me just pick one of these dates here. So let's say the year 2000. It's a bit simplified, but for 00, is this the 00 tax rate? Is this the 00 nominal GDP or real GDP? If it's the income for 2000. Nominal. Why? Somebody other than Todd. That's correct. Thank you. Extra credit point. Good guess. You had a 50-50 shot. You gambled and it paid off. Why is it nominal? It's kind of a simple question, so don't think too hard. But why is it nominal? I just kind of want to bring us back to the actual calculations
It's all
there.
2000, nominal and real GDP are the same thing.
Yeah, nominal GDP and real are, well, they're not the same with our inflation factor because our real GDP still could be calculated. It's probably not it's not able to be calculated at that time because it's a lagged once we figure out what the real inflation rate is. But your income is what you made is what you made. If your paycheck said that you made $65,000 this year, that is your nominal income, right? You run to Walmart with your $65,000 and buy stuff. You'll find out how real your paycheck was when you start putting stuff into your cart. And you might turn out to get screwed because of inflation, but the taxes were calculated on your nominal income, which is kind of a backdoor way of thinking about the inflation tax. If the government controls the money supply, and the money supply drives the inflation rate, and if the government chooses to run the printing press, which raises the inflation rate, isn't that kind of like a tax on you? Something that was out of your control, it was in control of the government. Instead of the inflation rate being 3%, it was 10%. You get your nominal paycheck of $100. You pay 10% to Uncle Sam because the tax rate was 10% on your nominal income, leaving you with $90 to go run to Walmart. But when you put stuff in your shopping cart after you got the paycheck, you found out that there was 10% inflation, and I put 10% less things in my shopping cart. It's kind of like a tax, isn't it? So the inflation rate is sometimes characterized as a tax. The government can kind of make out that way with inflating things by running the printing press. Kind of a backdoor way of talking about things we already did with Zimbabwe. If they run the printing press, if they don't actually collect tax, but they can print off their own money, ultimately the consumer will pay for it at the cash register because of the inflation. So it can have a similar impact in terms of your purchasing power. All right, so I guess to kind of tie this together, let's just note that this is the tax rate. We've done something like this before, but you might see a homework problem that comes in with this. This is your tax rate, and this is your nominal income. So the total tax collected is factored off of nominal GDP, and therefore the fluctuations in time are due to fiscal policy, in part. So from this little equation, this one is in control by the government, controlled by the government, 100%. That's our fiscal policy. Our nominal income is more determined by the people, but determined by other factors. You know, this is determined by many factors. Is there a war? What are the tax rates? What were the spending? What was Social Security? What were the transfer? I mean, everything we've been talking about this semester determines ultimately the GDP. And some economists would argue that that's not something that can be orchestrated by the government. That we will cause more harm than good by playing the puppet maestro of trying to tinker with. That was Hayek's argument in our Keynes versus Hayek. Top down or bottom up. You know, can we influence GDP in a good way? Some would argue not long term. You might be able to do something short term, but it'll have some negative implications long term. And there'd be less uncertainty if we just didn't mess around with it at all. All right, questions or comments there? We're going to talk a little bit more about the tax rates here in a bit after I show the spending. So the bottom graph shows our transfer payments. Expenditure on goods and services, kind of moving over time, changing a little bit. Our debt interest was actually a little bit fatter, narrows a little bit, and now it's been widening. And then our transfer payments. It's hard to show or see on this graph, but that's actually been getting taller as we move. You can kind of see it visually with this graph, but especially if we brought it out a few more years. But that gives you a nice visual over time that it doesn't erratically change a lot, right? The breakdown is roughly those percentages as a part of the big pie. All right, questions on that one at all? Okay, so let me put this back away here. How many people have heard the more you make, the more they take? Does that ring a bell? How many people that ring a bell? The more you make, the more they take. So one thing we want to look at in this chapter is how those tax rates actually work. I think I'll leave that up because that's kind of what I'm building off of. So, the more, let's put that quote on here, the more you make, the more they take. We're going to think about where that comes from. It comes from the tax rate going up, the richer you are. The higher income, when you fall into a higher income bracket, then they end up taking a little bit more money. So if we look at that in kind of a schedule form, putting our schedule goggles on, let me just make up some numbers here. So let's say your income is from 0 to 15,000. Maybe we won't even charge you anything. So a little t here, the tax rate is 0, because that's just not enough money to live on. And then from 15,000 and $1, the next bracket up, let's say 15,000 to 30,000, we're going to hit you at 15%. And then from 30 to 60,000, you're going to fall into the 25% bracket. And then anything over 60,000, you're going to pay 35% on. So I like to tell a little story about my buddy Mike Smith, who I was a cook at the Vineyard Steak and Lobster restaurant. He was kind of the line leader in this steak joint we were at. And he said one day, he's like, "Oh, Russ, I'm not gonna put in any more hours because it bumps me into a higher tax bracket and my paycheck goes down." And I'm like, I was just an undergraduate at the time, but knew some numbers. In fact, at this time, I think I was just in my first 2 years of school, so I had taken a principles class like you guys, and I'm like, "Mike, that can't be right." He's like, "Yeah, no, I've done it, man. I put in the overtime, and my paycheck actually goes down." And I'm like, "Wow, I don't think that's quite right." And what I found was that Mike was a little bit confused about how the tax rate system worked. And in his case, it was kind of with some withholdings as well. Okay, so let me first, before we jump into this, talk about withholdings. What are those? From your paychecks, you guys have withholdings. What is that? Are you actually paying the tax that at the time it comes out of your paycheck? What are withholdings? How is that different from the tax that you pay? You can get it back. That's right. So that's part of it. So what is the withholding? What is the employer and you doing with the withholding amount? And you're right, you can get it back. So it was not tax that you owed, but it was tax withheld. So important distinction there. When do you settle up with the tax man? When's the tax due date? Anybody remember? A little later than March 15th, 1 month, April. So April 15th is always tax day in the United States. Everybody's supposed to be settling up at that time. And so when you do the tax form, it's kind of your day of reconciliation. You've had withholdings for the whole year. That's what's showing up on your W-2. That's how much money was taken out of your paycheck. But that wasn't your tax that you owed. The tax that you owe depends on some other circumstances that may be going on in your life or other tax attributes. And so that is your day of settlement. The government withheld $2,000, but you actually only owed maybe $1,700, and so you're going to get a refund back of $300, right? So whatever that tax rate was. All right, so that was part of Mike's problem, was that he wasn't quite getting that. Apparently, when he put in overtime, I think he fell into a little bit higher withholding amount that actually did put him into some sort of bracket the way the employer, and they had to suck out more withholdings, but he was under the impression that he was actually losing money, like, so why should I work? And that was the part that he was missing, that the withholdings went up, so I didn't ever see his paycheck, so perhaps his paycheck went down, but he was still making the money. And as a side note, you guys can set with your employer how much you went withhold. That's your choice, not your employer's, not the IRS's, but if you don't withhold enough, the IRS says you owe me a penalty. So you're supposed to pay in a decent estimate of what you think you'll owe. All right, so how does this work? How does this work? And do you have any incentive? By the way, this is not the exact tax system. I didn't give you real numbers here. But if this was the tax system, would you have incentive to make $15,010? $15,100? Would that be worth your time? What do you think? If you fall into this higher bracket, is it worth your time? Let's do the math for a second. So roughly, if we earn that extra $100, but it fell into this bracket, we were at 0%, but now we're going to face 15%. How big of a number would that be? Is it worth would it overwhelm the $100 worth of income that I was making? Yeah, by a long shot, right? If you pulled out your calculator, you've got 15% of that extra 100 or that $15,000. Well, 10% would be 1,500. Half of that would be 750. We're talking $2,250 worth of tax for the extra 100 bucks that I earned. Do you think the United States would have that stupid of a setup? Be careful. Would we want to have a system to where there was no incentive for the person making $15,000 to work an extra overtime and make that extra 100? Would we want a system like that, that would make you fall into a tax bracket of $2,250, or that you'd have to pay that? Would that be a very smart system to disincentivize work that much at the margin? No. So our real system doesn't work that way at all. How does it work? If we make $15,100, what is the tax due? Yes, the 15% that you make over it. So you're going to pay 0% on the first $15,000 that you make. The next 100 does indeed fall into this level, which means you're going to pay 15% on just that extra 100, which is only 15 bucks. So now you're going to owe the government 15 bucks, right? And if you would have made $32,000, I want you to work with your neighbor on how much tax you owe. So for this example, if your income equals $32,000, how much tax do you owe? Go ahead and pull out your phones, flip them to airplane mode. If you want a calculator, if income equals $32,000, how much tax do you owe? So work with your neighbor. You're just going to break that $32,000 incrementally as we move through the brackets. Break that $32,000 apart. It's going to get treated in different ways. Start, Caleb.
Do you separate the brackets?
Yes. So the first 15 is going to be 0%. Then the next 15, since it's got to get up to 30, the next 15 is going to be at 15. And then the last 2,000 is going to be at the high rate of 25. Okay? Did you get that started?
We got that.
Oh, okay. How'd you get it? Just kind of show your work. Yeah, did we get it or did he get it and you wrote it down? Okay.
But
So
I was going to say to you, the first 15,000.
is that 0? Yeah. And then the next 15. Yep. And the next 2. No, the next 2 because it's only 32. So write that out. Show your work. Because on a test, you're going to have to show your work. 750. Okay, write out an equation that shows your work.
You get double tax.
No, you won't get double tax.
So it's
Up till 30, 32 is your total income, though. You do have to pay tax on your full 32. Okay, show your work for me so I can look at the answer nice and neat. So I know some of you aren't used to showing your work. I don't know. I don't know the answers. I just made up these numbers. That's why I can't see your work. Then no, you didn't do it right. Nope. So if we're having our equation goggles on, and I'm breaking apart my $32,000 worth of income, my tax, big T, is equal to 0% times how much? 15, the first 15,000, plus I'm going to pay 15% on the next 15,000. 15% times 15,000 plus the last 2,000 puts me into this bracket and gives me 25% tax on the last 2,000. What do you guys get for answers? Total tax. 3,000. 2,750? How many people got that? Good. All right, $2,750. What is your average tax rate? Average tax rate. If I said, how much did you get taxed this year, Joe? Well, I paid $2,750. How would you express to somebody how much you paid in taxes on average? The average tax rate divided by what? Nope, not. You don't need to do it. You don't even need to. It's easier than that. Average tax rate. How much did Joe pay in taxes? $2,750. How much income did he make? 32. So if I think of the tax he paid as a fraction of the income that he made, gives us the average income tax rate of $2,750 divided by $32,000. And what is that rate? 8.6? Do other people get that? I just made up these numbers, so I don't know. 8.6% is what I'm hearing from a couple different people. So my income tax for my situation of making $32,000 was this. If I'm LeBron James and you guys did the same thing, what do you think his average income tax rate would be awfully close to? He'd be right at this 35%, right? Because he also, LeBron got treated the same way. His first $15,000 for the first minute of work he did this year got paid 0%. His second minute of work got taxed at 15%, right? So LeBron's going to follow this all the way down, except down here it's going to be like $25 million times 35%. If I look at LeBron's average tax rate, it's going to shake out to be approximately 35%. So the rich pay proportionately more than the poor. LeBron's paying 35%. This average Joe down here is paying 8.6%. All right, we'll pick up there next time. Yes, good job.